Lie down on your side for a moment, right now if you can, and rest your hand along the curve where your hip meets your thigh. Do you feel a slight hollow there? A place where the line of your body dips inward instead of curving smoothly outward? Most people notice it and assume it's simply the shape they were born with, something fixed in their skeleton that no amount of effort could ever change. But what if that hollow isn't really about bone at all? What if it's actually a message your body has been sending you for years, quietly, through a muscle you've probably never thought about? That muscle sits on the outer edge of your hip, wrapping from the top of your pelvis down toward the side of your thigh bone. Physically, therapists call it the gluteus medius, and unlike the larger glute muscle most people picture when they think of hip strength, this one isn't built for power. It's built for control. Every single time you take a step, this muscle fires to keep your pelvis level, stopping your hips from dropping sideways as your other foot lifts off the ground. It works even when you're standing still, making tiny adjustments so you don't sway. It's one of the quietest muscles in the entire body, and also one of the most consequential, because when it weakens, the change doesn't announce itself with pain or an obvious injury. It shows up first as a shape. This is where the misconception usually begins. People notice the hollow along the hip, search for answers, and land on explanations about bone width, hip sockets, or simply genetics, as if nothing could be done. There is some truth buried in that idea, since skeletal structure does influence the exact contour of anyone's hips. But structure alone rarely explains a change that develops gradually over years, rather than existing from birth. If the dip has become more noticeable as you've aged, the far more likely explanation isn't that your bones shifted. It's that the muscle responsible for filling out and supporting that region has been quietly losing its tone, its activation, and its ability to do the job it was designed for. Muscle loss with age is not a mysterious process, though it's often talked about as though it were inevitable and irreversible. Research in exercise physiology has consistently shown that skeletal muscle tends to decline gradually after midlife, a process influenced heavily by how much a muscle is actually used. Muscles that are called upon regularly through walking varied terrain, climbing stairs, or shifting weight from side to side tend to retain more of their strength and size. Muscles that sit idle for long stretches, which is exactly what happens to the gluteus medius when someone spends most of the day sitting in a chair or a car seat, adapt in the opposite direction. The nervous system essentially deprioritizes muscle fibers it isn't asked to use, and over years, that quiet neglect becomes visible. Here's the part that surprises most people. It isn't really about age at all, not directly. Age is simply the backdrop against which decades of sitting, limited lateral movement, and repetitive straight-line walking accumulate. Someone in their 30s who spends 10 hours a day seated and rarely moves sideways can develop the same underactive hip pattern as someone 20 years older who happens to walk daily but never challenges their hips in any other direction. This matters because it reframes the entire situation. The hip dip isn't a countdown clock tied to your birth year. It's closer to a reflection of movement patterns, and movement patterns can be changed at almost any stage of life. Once that muscle starts underperforming, the consequences rarely stop at appearance. Think about the mechanics for a moment. If the gluteus medius is responsible for keeping your pelvis level while you walk, a weaker version of that muscle means your pelvis drops slightly every time you shift weight onto that leg. Most people never consciously notice this happening, but their body compensates in ways that eventually surface as symptoms elsewhere. The knee on that side often rotates inward slightly to help stabilize the leg, which over years can contribute to knee discomfort that seems completely unrelated to the hip. The lower back muscles frequently step in to help control the sideways drop, tightening more than they should and contributing to the kind of persistent stiffness many people simply accept as part of getting older. None of this happens overnight. It builds slowly, one uncorrected step at a time, until the body has rerouted itself around a weakness nobody ever addressed. There's also a balance component that deserves attention, because it connects a seemingly cosmetic issue to something far more significant for long-term independence. Balance relies heavily on the hip's ability to make instant micro-corrections when your center of gravity shifts, whether you're stepping onto an uneven sidewalk, catching yourself after a stumble, or simply standing on one leg to put on a shoe. Studies in geriatric and rehabilitative research have repeatedly linked hip abductor strength specifically the gluteus medius, to a person's ability to recover from a loss of balance before it becomes a fall. This doesn't mean weak hips guarantee a fall, and it certainly isn't a reason for alarm. But it does mean that the muscle responsible for shaping the side of your hip is the same muscle largely responsible for keeping you steady when the ground beneath you isn't perfectly predictable. So why doesn't this muscle just strengthen itself through everyday walking, the way people assume it should? The answer lies in the direction of movement. Walking forward primarily challenges the muscles that move your legs forward and backward, not sideways. The gluteus medius controls lateral and rotational stability, movements most modern lifestyles simply don't demand very often. Unless you're regularly stepping sideways, climbing at an angle, or standing on one leg while reaching in another direction, this muscle can go through an entire week, minimal meaningful activation. It isn't laziness or a personal failing. It's simply a mismatch between how the muscle is designed to work and how most daily environments are structured. Understanding the mechanism naturally raises the next question, which is what it actually takes to wake this muscle back up. And the honest answer is less than most people expect. This isn't a muscle that responds well to heavy loading or high-intensity effort. It responds to precise, controlled, low-resistance movement performed with genuine attention to form. A resistance band placed just above the knees while seated, followed by slowly pressing the knees outward against that tension, activates the gluteus medius directly without placing strain on the joints. What matters isn't how far the knees move or how much resistance is used. What matters is the quality of the contraction and the ability to feel the muscle working along the outer hip rather than letting the front of the thigh take over, which is a common substitution pattern the body falls into when the intended muscle has been inactive for a long time. Lying on your side and lifting the top knee while keeping the feet together, a movement often called the clamshell, offers a similarly precise way to isolate this muscle, but only when performed with restraint. The instinct is usually to lift the knee as high as possible, yet the moment the hips begin rolling backward to allow that extra range, the effort shifts away from the gluteus medius and into the lower back. The smaller, more controlled range, where the hips stay perfectly stacked, is exactly where the intended muscle does its work. This is a useful principle that applies across nearly every hip stability exercise. Bigger movement is not the same as better activation, and in this particular case, restraint often produces more benefit than reach. A side-lying leg raise takes this a step further by extending the lever arm of the leg itself, increasing the demand on the hip without needing any external resistance. Lifting the top leg only 12 to 18 inches, with the toes pointing forward rather than up toward the ceiling, keeps the emphasis on the gluteus medius rather than allowing the hip flexors at the front of the leg to take over the movement. That detail about toe direction matters more than it might seem. Rotating the toes upward changes the angle of pull at the hip joint just enough to recruit a completely different set of muscles, which is why two people can perform what looks like the same exercise and get very different results. Moving on to hands and knees introduces a different kind of challenge, because now the hip has to stabilize the entire body's positioning while one leg moves independently, closer to the demands of real walking than any of the lying positions can replicate. Lifting one knee out to the side while keeping the hips level and facing the floor, a movement some called the fire hydrant because of its resemblance to a dog lifting its leg, trains the muscle to fire while the torso is actively working to stay upright and unrotated. This combination of movement and stability is closer to what the gluteus medius is actually asked to do during a normal walking stride, which is why this stage tends to translate more directly into everyday improvements in how steady someone feels while moving around. The most demanding version of this progression combines strength with balance directly through a side plank with the top leg lifted. Supporting the body's weight on one forearm while raising the hips into a line already asks a great deal of the entire midsection and hip complex. And adding a slow leg lift on top of that turns the exercise into something closer to a full body coordination challenge than an isolated muscle movement. This is usually the last stage introduced, not the first, because the nervous system benefits from relearning the basic activation pattern in simpler positions before being asked to maintain it under this much additional demand. Rushing into it too early often results in the body finding shortcuts, using momentum or the shoulder and back muscles to fake the motion rather than genuinely strengthening the hip. What makes this progression meaningful isn't any single exercise in isolation, but the order and pacing in which they're introduced. Muscles that have been underactive for years don't respond well to sudden intensity. They respond to a gradual reintroduction of the movement patterns they were designed for, starting with small, controlled ranges of motion and slowly increasing complexity as the connection between brain and muscle strengthens. This is sometimes called neuromuscular re-education, and it explains why someone can perform an exercise correctly on paper and still not feel it working in the right place until several sessions in. The muscle broken. It simply needs the signal restored, and that takes repetition more than it takes effort. It's worth acknowledging that not everyone will experience this process the same way, and that's not a flaw in the approach but a reflection of how varied human bodies genuinely are. Someone recovering from a hip or knee injury, someone with significant balance concerns, or someone managing an existing joint condition should approach any new movement pattern with guidance from a healthcare provider familiar with their specific history, since what helps one person's hips may need to be modified for another's. Age alone doesn't determine how quickly muscle activation improves, nor does it guarantee a particular outcome. Genetics, activity history, and overall health all play a role, which is why patience matters more than comparing progress to anyone else's timeline. There's also a quieter psychological layer to all of this that rarely gets discussed. Many people who first notice a hip dip experience a subtle shift in how they move through the world, becoming slightly more cautious on stairs, slightly more hesitant on uneven ground, without ever consciously deciding to change their behavior. The body senses instability before the mind fully registers why, and that instinctive caution, while protective in the moment, can gradually shrink someone's confidence in their own movement. Rebuilding strength in this muscle group often restores something less tangible than visible shape, a sense of trust in one's own steadiness that tends to influence how freely someone moves, travels, and engages with daily life. None of this requires transforming your entire routine overnight. The most sustainable path tends to begin with just a couple of these movements, performed slowly and attentively a few times a week, allowing the connection between brain and muscle to rebuild before adding complexity. Progress in this area is rarely dramatic from one week to the next. It shows up instead as a gradual sense of steadiness that's easy to miss in the moment and only becomes obvious in hindsight, when stairs feel less effortful than they used to, or standing on one leg to put on a shoe no longer requires holding onto something for balance. Perhaps the most useful shift in perspective is recognizing that a hip dip was never really a flaw to correct for the sake of appearance. It's closer to a small, visible signal from a much larger system responsible for keeping you upright, steady, and capable of moving through the world with confidence. The shape it creates is simply the surface expression of something happening underneath, in the quiet, constant work of a muscle that rarely gets acknowledged until it stops doing its job well. Paying attention to it isn't really about changing how your hips look from the outside. It's about listening to what your body has been trying to tell you all along, and choosing to respond before the message gets louder.